What are people willing to do for money? The Osage Indian tribe, once considered the wealthiest nation in all of America, fully experienced the answer to this very question. Sophisticated fraud schemes, house bombings, slow poisonings, and even marriages of convenience. All of these tactics became the arsenal of white Americans, used to seize the wealth of prosperous Native Americans. And later, those terrible years went down in history under the name The Reign of Terror. Hello everyone, you're watching the channel based on real events. My name is Mikhailo Stak. And today we're going to discuss Martin Scorsese's film, Killers of the Flower Moon, released in the year 2023, and some real-life historical events that inspired its creation. In this video, I'm going to tell you who the Osage people are, how they became the wealthiest nation of their era, how, with the American government's participation, white Americans constructed a scheme to seize the wealth of the Native Americans, how accurately Scorsese's film depicts the true events, and what fascinating details were not included in the film. The Osage, or as they called themselves, the Osage, people of the Middle Waters, for centuries lived in the Ohio River Valley, roughly in modern-day Kentucky. Their daily life combined villages with long houses, farming, and seasonal nomadic bison hunts. This unique economy, combining village life with the vast prairie, allowed them to remain strong and entirely self-sufficient for many, many centuries. However, by the 17th century, they were compelled to begin a westward migration, primarily due to incessant warfare with the powerful Iroquois tribes. They eventually established their permanent settlements at the crucial intersection of what are today the modern states of Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. With the formation of the United States of America, the history of these and many other tribes drastically changed. The American government embarked on a policy of displacing indigenous tribes from rapidly appreciating lands, to open them up for white settlers and plantations, to lay railways, gain access to valuable minerals, and to secure state control over the West. Thus began a series of treaties between the United States and the Osage people regarding land concessions, through which the American government progressively limited their territory until in 1825 it forcibly relocated them even further west into Kansas. The tribe there survived several smallpox epidemics, which, however, brought the Osage people closer to the Catholic Church, because Catholic missionaries organized medical assistance for them. And that's how the Osage, who had mostly ignored the church before, slowly began to embrace Christianity. Then, in the year 1870, the government once again decided to relocate the Osage. The land where the tribe resided was declared essential for the state, so the Osage people themselves were once again slated for relocation, this time to what is now the territory of Oklahoma. However, on this occasion, the Osage experienced a stroke of luck for the very first time. The administration of the American President Ulysses S. Grant offered a very favorable price for their land holdings in Kansas. But here, the Osage acted unconventionally. They didn't wait for gifts from the government, nor did they go where they were told. Instead, with the money they received, they bought a new home in the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. Typically, when American authorities provided land for Native American reservations, they reserved the right to manage the resources of that land under specific conditions. But the Osage, after making their payment, became the full and rightful owners of their designated territory, a vast area spanning nearly 6,000 square kilometers. This ownership encompassed not only the surface land itself, but also everything that lay deep within its subsurface. However, back then, no one truly cared, because these lands were widely considered barren and quite cheap. A little over 2,000 people made it to their new home, but they survived, gathered themselves, and began to build an economy from scratch. Initially, this was through cattle grazing, then through leases. And then, the most important thing happened, which several decades later brought both great wealth and great misfortune. In 1894, significant oil reserves were discovered beneath the reservation's land. The government then permitted private companies to extract it, with the Osage themselves receiving 10% of the revenues. Later, the state of Oklahoma was formed there, and within it, the separate Osage County. Then, the tribe's principal chief, James Big Heart, signed a new deal with the government. Under it, each of the over 2,000 members had the right to a land plot and an equal share of the oil revenues found there. This share of rights was called a head right, and it gave people a portion of the profit from each barrel of oil. By the late 1910s and into the early 1920s, powerful oil gushers erupted on the Osage lands, and the Osage people suddenly became incredibly wealthy. It's estimated that in 1923, at the very peak of the oil boom, the tribe received over $30 million in annual oil revenue. This is roughly $500 million, considering today's prices. On a per capita basis, they were likely the wealthiest people in the entire world at that time. And so, in the prairies of Oklahoma, luxurious mansions and expensive automobiles began to appear. It was even said that in those days, for every group of 11 Americans, there was only one automobile. But among the Osage, it was quite the opposite. 11 automobiles for each and every Osage person. At the same time, the Osage were hiring white people to work for them as servants. And this was quite an interesting irony. At that time, America was deeply permeated with racism, both towards African Americans and its indigenous peoples. And in this very racist era, the wealthy Osage Indians actually had white people working for them. So, do you really think their white neighbors enjoyed seeing the Indians feasting on all that oil money? Certainly not. Some were openly envious, while others believed the wild Osage were not worthy of such wealth. They claimed they were uncivilized and incapable of managing such a fortune. Soon after, these ideas took on an official form. What began as conversations over a bottle of beer transitioned into American government policy. In 1921, Congress introduced for the Osage a kind of guardianship system. This meant that any Osage individual, whom the government deemed incapable of managing their own financial affairs, was compelled to have a white guardian appointed to oversee and control their entire wealth. The actual underlying criterion for this supposed incompetence, however, was simply their racial origin. The vast majority of full-blooded Osages, even adults and educated ones, were deemed incapable of managing their finances simply because they were Native Americans. So, if you're a full member of the tribe, sorry friend, you needed a guardian from the local respected white community to spend your own money. The guardians, you see, were local white attorneys, bankers, businessmen, and other such unscrupulous individuals who recognized in this a magnificent chance to exploit and profit from the fortunes of others. This created a terrible system of exploitation. Investigations by the Indian Rights Association revealed that guardians openly robbed their Osage wards, illicitly appropriating at least $8 million from their accounts in various ways. Guardians often allowed the Osage only crumbs from their own profits. Striking cases of abuse were recorded. For example, for some wealthy Osages, the guardian would only give money for food, hiding the rest. For others, goods were bought at several times inflated prices, and they split the kickback, while some were not even provided with the bare necessities, as the white guardian built his own businesses with the Osage's income. At the same time, the phenomenon of mass marriages of convenience emerged. Hundreds of white adventurers rushed to marry Osage people, primarily young women, to gain entry into wealthy families. Advertisements like, "I would like to marry a rich Indian woman. I will pay the intermediary $25 for every $5,000 from her estate," they openly sent to Oklahoma. One witness from those times recalled a group of operators who cold-bloodedly divided wealthy Native Americans among themselves. It was like, "You take these ones, and I'll take those." And after the marriage or guardianship was established, they just had to wait for the right moment for oil to start paying dividends, or for the head right owner to die and leave an inheritance. In this very climate, many white men even began to sue for guardianship over the Osage. For example, in the early 1920s, in Pawhuska, the capital of Osage County, where approximately 8,000 people resided, there were as many lawyers as in Oklahoma City, which had a population of 140,000 residents. This highlights an abnormally high concentration of legal professionals in a small town. And it was quite obvious that it wasn't limited to just fraudulent schemes. Suddenly, members of the Osage community began dying one by one under mysterious circumstances, from bullets, poison, or dynamite. Since 1921, following the implementation of the guardianship system, incidents became so prevalent that the Osage people themselves christened this era the Reign of Terror. In just the first half of the 1920s, more than 60 individuals from the Osage Nation were either murdered or passed away under highly mysterious circumstances. Officially, the authorities acknowledged far fewer, only about 24 intentional murders, as many deaths were often disguised as accidents or natural causes. For example, when a body was found without any obvious signs of violence, the doctor might write in the report, "Died from poor digestion," or "a strange debilitating illness." Shootings were often declared suicides, and poisonings were attributed to the accidental consumption of poor-quality alcohol. Autopsies were not performed, investigations were almost never opened, and suspicious circumstances were ignored or concealed through bribes. In other words, the Osage were literally cut down one by one, and the authorities simply watched in silence. So, shortly after, the Osage Reservation, which had shown the world its wealthiest inhabitants, simultaneously became a place with, perhaps, the highest rate of violent death per capita in all of America. They were killed, by the way, not only for their money, but also due to a profound disregard for Native American lives. This was because local white opportunists simply did not consider the indigenous people to be full-fledged human beings. However, money was indeed the primary motive. Among the very first to be lured by the Osage's considerable wealth was local Oklahoman businessman William Hale. He hailed from Texas, and in his younger years, he worked as a cowboy. Eventually, after accumulating sufficient funds, he settled in what is now Oklahoma and established his own ranch. Over time, Hale gradually became the dominant local magnate. He simultaneously owned a controlling stake in the regional bank, held interests in various businesses from local stores to funeral homes, and even served as an honorary deputy sheriff. Among the locals, Hale was widely regarded as a respected businessman, and he himself proudly proclaimed to be the king of the Osage Hills. Further investigation came to the conclusion that he acquired the majority of his fortune by fraudulent means. However, throughout the 1910s, Hale meticulously cultivated an image as a trusted friend and dependable business associate of the Osage people, establishing numerous valuable connections within their tribal council. Despite this public facade, in private conversations, he consistently spoke disparagingly about the Indians, asserting that they received their wealth unfairly, as these riches rightfully belonged to white people, and indeed, to him personally.
As I previously mentioned, many white individuals at that time desired to acquire the Osage's wealth by marrying someone from the tribe.
And it was Hale who was one of the first to implement such a scheme. Of course, he himself didn't marry a wealthy Osage woman, but instead, in 1917, he married off his 24-year-old nephew, Ernest Burkhart, to 30-year-old full-blooded Osage woman, Molly Kyle. In Martin Scorsese's film, Killers of the Flower Moon, this moment is a separate, colorful scene. A traditional Native American wedding with many diverse traditions, a grand celebration, music and dancing. In truth, in reality, it's quite unlikely their wedding ceremony was as traditional and grand as depicted, considering Molly had already been married on a previous occasion, and it's highly improbable she would have desired to arrange another comparable public celebration, as was stated by the film's production designer Jack Fisk. At the same time, according to his statements, Martin Scorsese simply wished to portray for the viewers a traditional Osage wedding ceremony, and for this specific reason he used Molly and Ernest's marriage within the film. However, as the film depicts, William Hale arranged a marriage for his nephew, already harboring a sinister plot in his mind. Molly suffered from diabetes, so Hale hoped she wouldn't live too long and would leave her money to her husband. At the same time, Hale also took extra precautions. He placed Molly into the care of his personal physicians, who would periodically administer small amounts of poison, disguised as medicine for her diabetes. In the film, Ernest, portrayed by Leonardo DiCaprio, is fully aware that Molly is being poisoned. In reality, Burkhart never acknowledged his knowledge of Molly's poisoning, even though he ultimately confessed to every single crime. Perhaps this was the only sin he couldn't bring himself to confess. Or perhaps Hale simply didn't trust him to murder his own wife. Despite this, Molly's single death wouldn't have been enough, as she had many healthy relatives who would have inherited her money in the event of her passing. So, yes, strange deaths began to occur within Molly's family. Just as depicted in the film Killers of the Flower Moon, Molly's sister Minnie suddenly passed away first. Doctors couldn't determine the exact cause of death. Then, the body of Molly's second sister, Anna Brown, was discovered. She was killed by a gunshot to the head. The film Killers of the Flower Moon doesn't show that Ernest's younger brother, Brian Burkhart, was actually arrested and charged with Anna's murder initially because he was the very last person to see the young woman alive. However, he was later acquitted and then released due to an insufficient amount of evidence. And after that, the entire case went completely cold. A few weeks later, the body of Anna's cousin, Charles Whitehorn, was discovered. He had also been shot. Then, 2 months later, Molly's mother, Lizzie Kyle, passed away from a mysterious illness. Subsequently, another cousin of the sisters, Henry Roan, was murdered. He was found in his own car with a bullet in his head. At that particular time, besides Molly, her other sister, Rita Smith, was still alive. Her husband Bill had long suspected that the deaths in the family were not accidental, and gradually began to question and press the police. Sometime later, the Smith family's house was destroyed by a powerful dynamite explosion. Rita and her maid Nettie died on the spot, and Bill passed away 4 days later in the hospital. So, one by one, the entire family was wiped out. Only Molly remained alive, but her condition was also critical. William Hale's diabolical plan was nearing its completion. By then, the tribal council was also conducting its own investigation, as Molly Kyle's family members weren't the only Native Americans in the county who had begun to die suddenly. By 1923, there were already dozens of such cases. But, despite all the uproar in the reservation, the local police and Oklahoma authorities failed to see any problem. Why? Because, as it turned out, many people were in league with the murderers. Corruption was eating away at the county, through and through. The sheriff, the judge, and even the doctors all either got their share of the oil pie or simply feared for their own lives, so they turned a blind eye to the deaths of the Native Americans. If any honest law enforcement officers were found, they were quickly bribed or intimidated into silence, and some of the overly curious ones were physically eliminated. For instance, one white oilman who had been helping the Osage people was discovered murdered in Washington, D.C., and a private detective was thrown from a moving train, landing headfirst beneath its wheels. And this is not a scene from some Hollywood action movie, but a truly horrifying reality. The man was traveling with all his collected evidence to Washington, but he never actually made it there. Eventually, the Osage community, frightened and outraged, realized they couldn't cope on their own and officially appealed to the authorities of the United States of America for help. And in response, the federal government sent Bureau of Investigation agents to Oklahoma. That's what the young agency, later known as the FBI, was called then. The Bureau's deputy, 26-year-old John Edgar Hoover, knew this was a great chance to prove their structure's effectiveness. So he took this case seriously and provided all necessary resources. Hoover assigned experienced former Texas Ranger Tom White, portrayed in the film by Jesse Plemons, giving him a team of several agents who secretly arrived in Osage County working undercover. In Martin Scorsese's film, this appearance of federal agents is shown closer to the finale. And indeed, historically, they got involved when most of the murders had already occurred, and it was necessary to unravel the conspiracy and gather evidence. Tom White and a portion of his team operated openly, while the remainder of his agents, posing as cattlemen, insurance salesmen, and merchants, began to discreetly gather crucial evidence and intelligence on the ground. The investigation's primary focus became Henry Roan's case, as he had been murdered in a territory where federal authorities held undisputed jurisdiction. It wasn't long before agents noticed that the same names kept appearing in many leads: William Hale, his nephew Ernest Burkhart, and another fellow farmer and cowboy, John Ramsey. They were uncovered through a mix of intelligence work and likely secret messages from co-conspirators. Eventually, one of the intimidated plotters made a deal. Under the weight of evidence, Ernest Burkhart was the first to surrender. He was isolated from his uncle's influence, and he began to give testimony. Ernest revealed that John Ramsey had shot Henry Roan following Hale's direct instructions. And soon after, the arrested Ramsey confessed to his part in the bombing of the Smith home, and once again named Hale as the organizer, as well as two accomplices, the well-known bootlegger Henry Grammer and the hired gun, Ace Kirby. Both characters didn't live to see their arrest. However, in the investigation, Grammer died in a car crash and Kirby was shot by unknown assailants. Their own accomplices likely eliminated them as unwanted witnesses. Despite this, the full picture eventually became clear. All leads pointed to William Hale, the king of the Osage. So, in early 1926, law enforcement conducted a series of arrests. William Hale, Ernest Burkhart, and John Ramsey were the very first to be apprehended. A short time later, formal charges were brought against two additional individuals: the contract killer Kelsey Morrison and Byron Burkhart, Ernest's younger brother. During his testimony, Kelsey Morrison confessed to Anna Brown's murder at Hale's command. And here, by the way, is a very interesting and also terrible detail the film missed. Later, investigators discovered William Hale had a relationship with Anna Brown, and there was even evidence Anna was carrying his child. So Hale may have killed his own unborn child when he ordered Anna to be shot. In Scorsese's film, it's only briefly mentioned that Anna was pregnant, but they don't specify who the father was. Overall, the legal proceedings against the perpetrators gained widespread all-American notoriety. Newspapers quickly dubbed it the case of the Indian murders. A change of jurisdiction, the relocation of hearings to various cities, and other formal procedural details prolonged this trial for as long as 3 years. Gale hired a team of expensive lawyers, and using his money, he orchestrated bribes and pressured the jury. However, eventually Ernest Burkhart, realizing his hopeless situation, struck a deal with the prosecution. In June of 1926, he officially pleaded guilty to participating in a conspiracy, specifically organizing an explosion that killed his brother-in-law and his wife's sister. The state of Oklahoma sentenced him to life imprisonment. At the same time, Ernest gave extensive testimony against his uncle. And ultimately, in January of 1929, William Hale, who had once been the untouchable king of the Osage Hills, was condemned to a life sentence in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. A similar fate befell several other participants in the conspiracy. The brutal killings came to an abrupt halt from the very moment Hale and his criminal gang were apprehended. Yet, a sense of complete justice was notably absent. The verdicts didn't bring back the dead, and it soon became apparent that the killers' sentences wouldn't last all that long. Just a few years later, once the public outcry had completely subsided, all those who were convicted began to petition for clemency. Despite the widespread outrage and fervent protest from the Osage community, the justice system ultimately extended mercy to the killers. William Hale had served a prison sentence of only 18 years. In the year 1947, he was conditionally released from prison. That same year, John Ramsey and Ernest Burkhart were also released from prison alongside him. And then, what followed was an absolutely outrageous episode. In 1965, the governor of Oklahoma issued a full pardon to Ernest Burkhart, thereby clearing his criminal record. So, the one who took part in the murder of his own family, a pregnant woman, and his wife's other relatives was cleared by the law by the end of his life. Molly, however, survived those terrible years. She was saved from poisoning in time when she came under the care of doctors not connected to Hale. Early in the trials, realizing the extent of the betrayal, she filed for divorce from Ernest Burkhart and continued her life in her homeland, raising her children from her marriage to Ernest. The woman passed away at the age of 50 from diabetes, without ever receiving any particular acknowledgement or reparations for her family's tragic fate. Meanwhile, the heinous crimes committed against the Osage people ultimately reverberated all the way to Washington. This case helped strengthen the newly created FBI. Later, after heading the agency, J. Edgar Hoover proudly recalled this case as the Bureau's first major victory in the fight against crime. Many American newspapers wrote about the trial, calling it almost the last war of the Wild West, where Native Americans were once again destroyed for land and wealth, but now in a new, insidious way. However, beyond the newspaper headlines, there remain some very unpleasant facts, which only fully came to light over time. Firstly, officially, the justice system acknowledged only 24 murders directly linked to the conspiracy of Gale and his associates. However, in reality, the actual number of victims might have potentially reached several dozens or even hundreds of individuals. Many wealthy Osages, especially those who were alone or defenseless, died quietly and unnoticed in those years. Simply, no one looked for a crime where an Indian had died. Secondly, the conspiracy was much wider than Hale's group. Only a few individuals ended up in the dock, but a significant portion of the local white population actually became accomplices in this genocide. Guardians, doctors, judges, jurors, and even shop assistants, many of them were part of it. Some were killing and others were covering for the murderers. Some were poisoning while others simply overlooked the obvious signs of poisoning. As one of the Osage leaders later stated, the real question was not about who had conspired, but rather who had not conspired against them. For the Osage people themselves, enduring that terrible ordeal became a truly tremendous trauma. The reign of terror was forever seared into the nation's collective memory, as practically every single Osage family lost someone. As of the year 2023, from the more than 2,000 initial head rights that the Osage people originally possessed, a full quarter are currently held by non-Osage individuals. They are still held by some universities, churches, and descendants of those very guardian families. The guardianship system for wealthy Native Americans, despite everything, also lasted a long time. In fact, it was only abolished in the late 70s when states generally revised their policies toward indigenous peoples, granting them greater autonomy. However, only in 2011, the American government paid the Osage monetary compensation for many years of improper accounting of oil profits and potential embezzlement. This amounted to almost $400 million. For many long decades, the Osage massacre outside of Oklahoma was almost never mentioned. This topic wasn't featured in American school textbooks, nor in popular culture. However, towards the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century, the situation slowly began to change. Younger generations of the Osage people, along with various researchers, have expressed a keen interest in uncovering the truth. However, the true explosion of interest in this particular subject occurred in 2017, when journalist David Grann released his non-fiction bestseller, Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI. Grann undertook a monumental task. He delved into FBI archives, journeyed to Osage, and conversed with the descendants of eyewitnesses, examining countless court documents and period newspapers. His book meticulously recounted this story to the general public about the tribe's oil wealth, about Ernest Burkhart's betrayal, about Hale's cold-bloodedness, about Molly's poisoning, and about Tom White's investigation. What's important is that Grann didn't limit himself to famous court cases. He also presented evidence that other conspiracies against the Osage might have been active beyond Hale's plot, and that the FBI had only uncovered some of the murders. This book instantly became a bestseller, won several literary awards, and made the whole country talk about the Osage tragedy. And many readers were truly shocked how such a story could remain in the shadows for so long. And it's really no surprise that such a chilling and horrific story eventually caught the attention of Hollywood. The film rights for the book, even before its official release, were acquired by renowned film director Martin Scorsese, known for his epic crime dramas. Scorsese decided not merely to film a detective story about solving a crime. For him, it was crucially important to portray the Osage people themselves, their culture, their pain, and their lives. The director understood that for many decades, American cinema repeatedly falsely and stereotypically depicted indigenous people. In most American films of the 20th century, Native Americans were indeed portrayed as wild, uncivilized, aggressive, and uneducated people. So Scorsese decided that this time, he needed to act differently. The first step he took was to meet with the leadership of the Osage Nation. He traveled to the Osage and had a long conversation with their principal chief, Jeffrey Standing Bear. The chief confessed that initially, when he heard about the upcoming film, he was quite apprehensive because outsiders would be portraying their tragedy. However, during a personal meeting, Scorsese managed to calm his fears. The director promised to shoot on location in Oklahoma, to involve authentic Osage people as both consultants and actors, and to approach their culture with profound respect. Simultaneously, Chief Standing Bear presented his primary demands. The film needed to feature authentic language, attire, and rituals, specifically those of the Osage people, without any fictional embellishments or customs from other tribes. Furthermore, the community itself wished to actively participate in the entire production process. And so, it came to pass. The film, Killers of the Flower Moon, was shot throughout 2021 in various towns across Oklahoma, precisely where these real-life events originally unfolded. For example, in the city of Pawhuska, they recreated an entire district from the 1920s with dirt roads, wooden shops, and even ran an old steam locomotive along the railway line. Nearly 100 Osage individuals were involved in various crowd scenes and smaller episodic roles. They served as extras for festivals and street scenes, provided assistance to the costumers and set decorators, and offered detailed consultations to the camera operators. Osage seamstresses were responsible for sewing the traditional garments. Masters instructed Hollywood actors on how to perform the Osage dance, and most importantly, the movie featured the authentic, living Osage language, which was carefully taught to the actors by its native speakers. Chief Standing Bear, upon viewing the film, emphasized on multiple occasions that it was truthful and authentic, particularly concerning its cultural depiction. It's interesting to note that the very first screenplay, which Scorsese and screenwriter Eric Roth collaborated on, primarily focused on the FBI agents, reflecting the way Grant's book, upon which the film is partially based, was structured. Essentially, it was originally conceived as a crime thriller centered around an investigation. But after hearing the Osage's concerns, the director later reworked the concept. It became clear to him that the main drama wasn't unfolding in the Bureau's offices, but within families, between the victims and those who betrayed them. So the focus shifted to the story of Molly and Ernest Burkhart, their marriage, Molly's poisoning, Ernest's moral choice, and the influence of Uncle Hale. Consequently, in the final cut of the movie, which is almost 3.5 hours long, the main focus is not on the detective mystery of who the murderer is, because the audience knows right from the start that the white killers and the magnate Hale are responsible for all the crimes. Actress Lily Gladstone, who is of Indigenous heritage, took on the role of Molly. Leonardo DiCaprio brought to life Ernest Burkhart on screen, a truly complex and quite controversial character. He is not portrayed as a cartoonish villain. On the contrary, he's like a simple-minded World War I veteran who, it would seem, loves Molly and their children, but at the same time is greedy and weak before his uncle's authority. DiCaprio plays Ernest as a kind of tragic anti-hero. He is tormented by doubts, yet he continues to do evil. Some Osage consultants, by the way, didn't like this at all. They argued, if a person conspired to destroy your entire family, then there can be no talk of love, as it's beyond humanity. But the director, it seems, wanted to show how racism and greed can distort even real feelings. Robert De Niro played the role of the main antagonist, William Hale, and this is, without a doubt, one of the film's strongest aspects. De Niro masterfully shows Hale's duality. In public, a smiling philanthropist who speaks kind words to the Osage, gives cattle to the poor, and attends Indian weddings. But when he's left alone with his nephew, or a hired hand, the audience sees a cold-blooded criminal giving out orders on who exactly needs to be removed. The film even features a powerful scene where Hale stands among the Osage at the funeral of one of his victims. He feigns deep grief, while the audience already knows that he orchestrated it all. Such a scene is truly striking, because it was the absolute truth.
Historians state that the actual Hale often led funeral processions and participated in investigations as a concerned friend of the Osage.
Naturally, a film can't possibly encompass all the intricate details of a book, much less the complexities of real-life events. So, Scorsese made several plot cuts and alterations, which are also worth noting. For instance, in the movie, Molly travels to Washington and has a brief conversation with President Calvin Coolidge, imploring him for the protection of the Osage people. Historically, an Osage delegation did indeed meet with Coolidge in the 1920s. There are even photographs showing them presenting him with a traditional blanket. But there is no actual evidence that Molly herself ever spoke with the president about the murders. Likewise, in the film, a private investigator, William Burns, is shown, whom Molly allegedly hired. In reality, the family did indeed attempt to hire private investigators, but Burns himself at that time was heading the Bureau of Investigation and did not travel to Oklahoma. Overall, the motion picture, Killers of the Flower Moon, garnered significant acclaim from critics and the Osage people themselves. It is widely regarded as one of the most authentic Hollywood portrayals of an indigenous nation. Many events and details are accurately depicted. The explosion of the Smiths' home and Molly's secret poisoning with arsenic and the entire mechanism of acquiring head rights through marriage. So Grant's book and Scorsese's film together achieved what the Osage had waited for almost 100 years, drawing the attention of the entire world to a crime that had long been suppressed. Today, the Osage people, whose population numbers approximately 20,000 individuals, primarily reside within the state of Oklahoma, actively preserving their ancestral language and rich cultural heritage. They continue to derive income from oil resources, albeit now on a considerably reduced scale. The film, Killers of the Flower Moon, concludes with powerful footage of a traditional Osage dance performed in contemporary times, and this offers a significant ray of hope. The Osage Nation has persevered and continues to dance to their sacred drums. The story of their tragedy emerged from the shadows and became known to millions, meaning the memory of the victims will live on. And this is important not only for the Osage, but for all of America, which is thus partially attempting to reevaluate its forgotten pages of history. And with that, I'll be concluding my episode for today. If you found it interesting, please don't forget to leave a comment, give it a like, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so yet. But for now, that's all. So, until we meet again on the YouTube space.